Hi, I'm Diane Macedo. Today on ABC News Live, the new push to mask up again. With flu, RSV, and COVID cases rising across the country, what the CDC is saying about holiday plans with less than 2 weeks to go until Christmas. The race to repair a massive pipeline leak. 600,000 gallons of crude oil spilled into a Kansas creek. Now the federal investigation underway and what it could mean for gas prices. And splashdown. NASA's Orion moon capsule is back on Earth after a 1.4 million mile journey to circle the moon. Hear what the space agency is saying about how it's returned back to Earth, when and what this could mean for future space travel. But we begin with that warning from health officials. New mask advisories are in place in parts of the country as viruses spike nationwide. According to the CDC, 43 states are reporting high or very high levels of flu-like illnesses. Trevor Ault is at a hospital here in New York with the latest. Hi, Trevor.
Once again, health officials in many prominent locations are urging people to wear masks. That's the case here in New York City, in some spots in California and in Arizona. Not mask mandates, but masks strongly recommended. And the reason is because of the ongoing threat of the quote-unquote triple-demic with COVID, the flu, and RSV happening all at once. With COVID infections had been relatively flat for a while, but in the past week we saw the number of cases and the number of deaths both increase 50% over the week prior. As for the flu now, we believe we've surpassed 10 million flu-like illnesses. Could be the worst flu season that we've seen in a decade now, with most states, almost all of them, having high or very high levels of transmission. And so health officials are really doubling down here as we're approaching the holidays. People are about to gather. There is no end in sight for this coming surge. They really think that you could curb the transmission if you wear your mask indoors. That is especially true if you're considered high risk for illnesses. And don't forget, the CDC is still recommending you wear masks if you take public transportation, so planes, trains, and buses too. Diane?
Good to know. Trevor Ault, thank you. And crews are working to clean up the largest oil spill in the Keystone Pipeline's history. More than 500,000 gallons spilled into a Kansas creek before it was contained. Now investigators are working to find out what went wrong. ABC's Alex Perez has the latest from Kansas.
A race to repair a massive pipeline that spilled nearly 600,000 gallons of oil into this Kansas creek, and a federal investigation underway to determine what went wrong. TC Energy operates the Keystone Pipeline and is now working with the EPA on the cleanup. It's the largest on-land spill in nearly a decade. The company telling ABC News the exact cause of the leak remains unclear.
We've got our response crews working on responding to the incident, and we also do have our technical crews looking into the cause of this.
This pipeline, which carries oil from Canada to refineries in the U.S., shut down for now. TC Energy dispatching some 250 personnel working around the clock to keep the spill contained and manage cleanup.
We will not restart our system here until it is safe to do so and until we have regulatory approval.
Meanwhile, growing concerns the shutdown could jack up gas prices in the region.
If the pipeline remains down for a week or longer, some areas in the Plain States could see gas prices stop declining and could see increases of potentially 25 to 40 cents a gallon.
The spill in a rural area. Officials say water sources for nearby communities remain safe and say there's no immediate threat to the public.
And Diane, besides the cause, the other big question here is what will the long-term environmental impacts be? That question may not be answered for quite some time. It remains unclear when exactly the pipeline will resume normal operations. Diane?
All right, Alex Perez, thank you. Meanwhile, Congress is up against a deadline to fund the government by Friday or face a potential shutdown. ABC's Jay O'Brien joins me live now for more on that. Jay, how close are we to a deal here, and what are the sticking points at this point?
Yeah, Diane, they have until Friday to come to a deal. The clock is ticking. What they will likely do is punt and kick the can down the road till December 23rd. That would mean that lawmakers would be here right around the holidays. The sticking points appear to be non-defense spending. So the federal government's got defense spending, military spending, and then everything else: transportation, homeland security, education. That big chunk is where the disagreements appear to be. So there's a lot of ground to cover there. Again, likely to kick the can down the road road till December 23rd. That appears to be the real event horizon date in all of this. And then it becomes, will there be a deal by December 23rd for some kind of large-scale spending deal, or do they do some kind of stopgap measure because they can't come to an agreement? But one thing's for sure, with each passing day without a deal, or at least the framework of a deal, Christmas at the Capitol, lawmakers here over the holidays trying to hammer out a deal, becomes a lot more likely.
Jay, President Biden is also expected to sign the Respect for Marriage Act tomorrow, which aims to codify same-sex and interracial marriage rights into federal law. How significant is that, and what can we expect to see?
Well, Democrats call it historic. Speaker Pelosi said that this is something that she wanted to push over the finish line before she ended her tenure as Speaker come January. She called it a historic step forward. We heard similar things from Democrats when it passed yesterday. I was standing right here. I was talking to you on the air. We heard cheers from the House chamber when it passed. You can expect a lot of that mood to carry into the White House ceremony tomorrow. But President Biden has also said that there was uncertainty, is the quote that he issued after the Dobbs decision, and that this legislation goes as the antidote for some of that uncertainty, particularly as it comes to marriage rights. So you can expect to hear a lot of that from him tomorrow when he signs this into law.
And Jay, time is running out for Democrats to try to pass their priorities before Republicans take control of the House. So what are they focused on right now?
Well, the Senate, first off, has to pass the NDAA, the annual defense spending bill, and then it has to go to the president, where it's unclear whether or not he'll sign it because there were concessions made to Republicans to get that legislation to pass the House. One of them was taking out the vaccine mandate for military personnel. So the open question is, what is the White House's position on that ultimately if it does pass the Senate and get to the president's desk? But as you said, there are priorities that are somewhat falling by the wayside the closer we get to that new Congress in January. One of them is reforming the Electoral Count Act. The other one is raising the debt ceiling, raising the nation's limit on its credit card. That's teeing up a potential fight come next year.
All right, Jay O'Brien, always great to have you. Thank you. Ukraine is intensifying its attacks on Russian-occupied territory. Video circulating online shows a fire and damage after strikes on targets in Melitopol, which Ukrainians say was a Russian base. A Russian official says it was a civilian recreation center, confirming 2 people were killed. Foreign correspondent Tom Sufi-Burridge joins me live from Kyiv now for more on this. Tom, what's the latest on these attacks, and what do they mean, do you think, for where this conflict is right now?
Yeah, Diane, I think this shows that the Ukrainians still have the intent to take more territory. I mean, these type of missile strikes behind enemy lines that we've seen on a number of occasions over a period of months before the Ukrainians have launched offensives are basically to destroy, command and control the systems and the places which the Russians use to plan their war, and army bases as well. And I think it's significant that the Russians have at least admitted that people were killed in this attack. The video evidence we verified really shows a lot of carnage down at that site. The Ukrainians saying they've killed scores of soldiers in that attack. And I think the bigger picture here is that the war here is very much still alive. There's intense fighting around a city called Bakhmut. The Russians seem obsessed to try and take that city in the east. We're getting unverified information that the Ukrainians are suffering quite significant casualties in that fight, but they're holding their territory, broadly speaking. This war is not going away. We're seeing heavy shelling of the city of Kherson in the south, recently liberated by the Ukrainians. And the Russians are pressing on. Yes, the winter's set in. It's harder for either side to make significant gains, but the war is very, very much still hot at the moment.
So President Biden spoke with Ukrainian President Vladimir Zelensky yesterday. What are we learning about that call, Tom?
Well, I think the most significant thing, Diane, from the readout from the White House was that the U.S. is emphasizing its support now for Ukraine with respects to improving air defenses. We've seen the U.S. supply NASAMS, a very high technology advanced system, into Ukraine. At least 2 of those systems are in country now. More are promised. But the Ukrainians are saying they need more. The White House is emphasizing that this is a priority. We've seen the Russians constantly bombard and fire missiles and drones at Ukrainian infrastructure, at power stations. Over the weekend, they struck the city of Odessa, the biggest port city in the south, hitting power stations, again, cutting the power to hundreds of thousands of people in that city. There's a real sense of misery here, I think. There's determination in the face of that, but the Ukrainians are living, a lot of them, without power, without water at times, and without connectivity. It is a dire situation. Diane?
All right, Tom Sufi-Burridge, thank you. And we're learning some new data about hate crimes in the U.S. The FBI says more than 7,000 criminal incidents involving more than 8,000 victims were reported in 2021. Now, that's about on par with 2020, but the FBI says there was a nearly 30% drop in police agencies reporting data, and that makes it difficult to compare to previous years. Meanwhile, hate crimes against Asian Americans and crimes based on the victim's sexual orientation increased. ABC News contributor and former FBI agent Brad Garrett joins me live now for more on this. Brad, what stands out to you most from this report?
The amount of understated statistics, because that's always been a problem, Diane, particularly in hate crimes. People are hesitant to come forward. It looks like a number of large cities didn't report. So I'm not convinced. If you look at the first 6 months of this year, it went up. So I'm not convinced that it's actually gone down. And there's no indicators, at least based on what we see publicly day in and day out, from the shooting in Colorado Springs at Club Q to obviously the shooting in Buffalo, New York, of the supermarket. It goes on and on. The level of hate is still just as red hot as it was 6 months or a year ago.
So what does this tell you about hate crimes in this country? Do we have to change the approach with how we tackle them at all?
Well, that is the problem. Think how complex that might be. If people develop a certain bias as a child, which is going to translate into how they were raised, we all take that kind of stuff and other things, positive and negative, to adulthood. So that's a tricky thing to change. How do you open up people's minds that, look, you may not like the way society's changing, but it is changing, and you're going to have to learn how to work with it, because that is the reality. So if you combine how we're raised with social media, with media outlets that either directly or indirectly, in my view, sort of push this division of races, division of classes, it's a big problem.
Now, this report also shows a drop in police departments reporting data. What do you make of that, and how does that impact the FBI's ability to try to figure out more about these incidents to counter them?
It's always been a problem, except with major crimes, let's say like murder, is that the police sometimes, they don't even collect it internally in a way that really makes accurate sense as to the number of people that have reported to them. So I don't know that I would translate that into a lower priority by the police, but as police departments become smaller and they're pressed to do the immediate reactive type crimes situation, these type of crimes sometimes get pushed to the side as far as a priority, which I think can translate into not accurate numbers.
All right, Brad Garrett, we appreciate the analysis as always. Thank you. Coming up, new details about Brittney Griner's return home and her road to healing. Stay with us. Welcome back. We are learning new details about Brittney Griner's return home. The WNBA star is currently in a military medical facility in San Antonio, recovering from 10 months in Russian captivity and reuniting with friends and family. Senior White House correspondent Mary Bruce has the latest.
This is the joyful reunion months in the making. Brittney Griner finally reunited with her wife Sherelle, seen in this new photo with the top American hostage negotiator, Ambassador Roger Carstens, who personally delivered Griner back to the U.S. On Instagram, Sherelle thanking the hands seen and unseen that helped make it possible for me to see my wife again. Moments after gaining her freedom in a prisoner swap with Russia, Griner all smiles aboard the plane in photos shared with ABC. Greeting each crew member, Carstens saying Griner wanted to chat nearly the whole flight home, describing her 10-month ordeal in Russian custody.
She's in very good spirits and in good health, getting appropriate both mental health care as well as physical health care, just to make sure that she's ready for her reintegration back into American society.
Her time in a Russian prison camp grueling, evident in video released by Russian state media. Her lawyer telling ESPN she recently had the flu and decided to cut off her hair because it kept freezing in the harsh cold. Griner released in exchange for notorious Russian arms dealer Viktor Bout, known as the Merchant of Death for supplying heavy weapons to murderous dictators and armed groups. Bout sentenced to 25 years for conspiring to arm a terrorist group and kill Americans. In contrast, Griner was caught with hashish oil, a banned substance in Russia, and received a 9-year sentence. Her harsh punishment, the U.S. says, a sign Russia was using her as a political pawn amid their invasion of Ukraine. But Biden's decision to release Bout has drawn criticism from Republicans and some Democrats concerned about the precedent it sets.
We have to recognize wide-eyed that right now as Americans, we have made it clear that we are willing to do anything to bring a single American home.
The White House is also under growing pressure to bring home detained American Paul Whelan. Arrested on what the U.S. calls bogus espionage charges, Whelan, a former Marine, is now preparing to mark his 4th year in Russian custody.
They hold Mr. Whelan differently because of these espionage charges, and so we're working through that now. We have a better sense of the context here, where the Russians' expectations are, and we're just going to keep working at it.
Earlier on GMA, Robin Roberts sat down with Roger Carstens, the top hostage negotiator who brought Brittney Griner back to the U.S. Let's listen.
She said, look, I've basically been listening to Russian for 10 months. I want to speak English. I want to chat with people. And then as I tried to point her to her seat, she just walked right past me and went right to the crew and started introducing herself to the crew members. And honestly, I watched her, and she connected with everyone, looked in their eyes, shook hands, got to know their names. And only when that was all done did she go back. And I was really impressed at how she values other people, to include the people that were trying to bring her home.
Clinical psychologist Wisdom Powell joins me live now for more on this. Wisdom, thanks for being on. I know you're not directly involved in this case, but we do know that Griner's now in a military medical facility. She's receiving physical and mental health care. And based on your expertise and what we do know about her story so far, what do you think her road to recovery looks like? And what does it tell you that she was apparently very chatty on this flight home, eager to talk to people, and of course, eager to see her friends and family?
Well, first of all, welcome home, Brittney. And secondly, I think her display of compassion and her genuine appreciation really gives us some insight about the interior capacity that Brittney possesses. And I think that is the interior capacity that's going to make her recovery a lot less difficult. We know that prisons or carceral settings are inherently traumatic places that are designed really to control and surveil, and they can be dehumanizing, particularly for women and particularly for people who occupy positions of marginality and who come from communities like LGBTQ plus communities who are at higher risk for abuse and dehumanization in those settings. So with that information in mind, we can sort of understand a little bit about what her recovery may be like. But again, this is purely speculative, as we don't really know the full story of what Brittney endured. What we know for sure is that when individuals are in carceral settings, they have a higher risk for post-traumatic stress symptoms and post-traumatic stress disorder, which can present itself as hypervigilance, more difficulty concentrating, sometimes exaggerated startle, and re-experiencing. And that is why it is so important that in this moment that we really hold space for Brittney and that we allow her the time that she needs to heal, grow, and thrive.
Now, Griner's wife has been outspoken. The basketball community as a whole really rallied behind her cause and raised awareness about this case. How important is that support now for someone in her position?
It is critically important. In fact, what we know for sure is that when individuals return from carceral settings and they return to a family system, a support system, a village that wraps their arms around that person, the likelihood of their successful adaptation post-release is much higher. There's also potential for individuals to grow in the aftermath of these exposures. We sometimes refer to this as post-traumatic growth. And given what we've already borne witness to with respect to how Brittney is reintegrating, her compassion, her chattiness on the plane, it suggests that she has a firm foundation that actually sets her up for the possibility of rebounding from this experience, but not only just rebounding, but growing and finding new meaning and significance in what she's experienced.
All right, Wisdom Powell, great to have you. Thank you.
Wonderful to be here.
Coming up, NASA's Orion moon capsule splashes back down to Earth after a million-mile journey to the moon. What this could mean for the future of space travel when we come back. Welcome back and welcome home, Orion. The Artemis 1 Orion capsule has splashed down after a 25-day trip to circle the moon. It's just the first step in an ambitious plan to establish a long-term presence there and eventually send a crewed shuttle to Mars. Astrophysicist Hakeem Alushaei joins me live now for more on this. Hakeem, thanks for being on. What kind of data did Orion collect, and why is this so important?
Orion collected a lot of data. There was onboard data, and there were also 10 CubeSats that were jettisoned from the spacecraft. And these CubeSats are cheaper, they're more fragile, and this is one of the rare opportunities we had to send them into deep space. But if you look at all of the data that was collected, a good portion of it was based on understanding the spacecraft itself, because there was a lot of new technologies deployed, and also understanding how the deep space radiation environment will affect human bodies. And in particular, this mission was focused on female human bodies because there are different challenges. Women are more susceptible to radiation, and when they are exposed, then there's a greater damage of harm.
So let's get to the big question here. Does this get us closer to being able to travel to the moon or even one day Mars in the near future?
Oh, does it ever? Because if you look at what happened with the spacecraft itself, the Artemis mission, from launch to the performance in space to the re-entry into the Earth's atmosphere, all of which are incredibly challenging, everything went incredibly well. I mean, it's such a complicated mission. You don't even expect everything to go so well, but in this case, it did. And a lot of things were tried for the very first time. So kudos to all the engineers who made this happen.
So what does this mean for the next few missions, Artemis 2 and 3, set for probably 2024, 2025, at least around then? What are you looking for there?
Well, you know what? It's looking really good, right? So our main objective is to get astronauts out there and back home safely. So this was a completely uncrewed mission. The next mission will take astronauts around the moon, not to land on the moon. And then Artemis 3 will actually land astronauts on the moon. So what we're looking at now is there's data that's come back about how the environment is going to affect the astronauts. And there's also data about the spacecraft. And in particular, one of the things they're doing is they're reusing flight computers. And these flight computers have to be taken off of Artemis 1 and put on Artemis 2. And so those computers right now are being analyzed, or at least they're being recovered so they can be analyzed and understand if that's going to be a workable process. So there is a lot left to be done, but NASA is going about this one step at a time, and it is very impressive how well they've done so far.
All right, Hakeem Alushaei, we appreciate your time as always. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us. I'm Diane Macedo. Do stay with us as ABC News Live continues with more news, context, and analysis.
Hi everyone, George Stephanopoulos here. Thanks for checking out the ABC News YouTube channel. If you'd like to get more videos, show highlights, and watch live event coverage, click on the right over here to subscribe to our channel, and don't forget to download the ABC News app for breaking news alerts. Thanks for watching.